Tanya Kramer, I'm the events coordinator in the Office of College Relations here at Flagler College. Welcome to another installment of the Community Lecture Series. This year, the title of our series is called Challenges at the Crossroads, Finding Solutions to Local Issues. This year, our faculty is focusing on, and will continue to do so, on Ernest L. Boyer's work and how higher education's purpose has morphed throughout its 350-year history in the U.S. According to Boyer's argument, various countries' philosophies on its purpose range from a means to self-development to an end in itself. Since the GI Bill of 1944, people have seen the offer of an education as more of a right than a privilege, and its purpose as, quote, equipment for service. But now, just as when Boyer wrote his special report, Scholarship Reconsidered, in 1990, we are still facing continuously changing variables with seemingly no constants, shaping and reshaping the world around us. As an institution of higher education, we are a knowledge nucleus, nestled in a small, historic town, a town that is growing and in some ways out of our control. There will be strains, pressures, and new challenges to consider. How can we responsibly apply our knowledge to our surrounding societal context, prove helpful to our local population and institutions, and take our learning discoveries and explorations beyond the classroom and into the world, our world here of St. Augustine, Florida? So now a little bit about Dr. Lisa Baird. She comes to us to academia from a background in freelance writing and film production. All her life, she has loved stories and pictures, words and images. Her love of the two forms led her to pursue a career in film production. When she pursued more academic interests, her background in writing and film informed her critical study of the union of words and pictures in new media. Her recent book, Eloquent Design, Essays on the Rhetorics of Vision, is the result of the study of the confluence of stories and pictures. She is currently working on a dystopian novel for young adults under consideration at Arthur Levine Publishing. Here at Flagler College, Lisa teaches creative nonfiction, world literature, and the class that I take, the Bible is Literature. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Baird.
Well, thank you and good morning. It's such an honor to be here, and thank you for letting me speak to you today. Thank you for coming, making the arduous trip, or not arduous trip, to get here. Anyway, I'll be speaking today on the screen life, the digital divide in academia and community. So I'll begin. We are people of the book. Our culture has been called a book culture because of the preeminence of the book in our midst. The book shapes our identity as a society because all the discoveries of our present life, all the histories of the past, all of our intellectual, philosophical, and artistic expression is exchanged and preserved through the presence of a simple, unassuming little object, a book. The technologies for book production have been with us for centuries and have proven to be the most successful technologies ever for recording, preserving, and circulating human knowledge. Until recently. The past decade and more has seen an unprecedented shift in writing technology as the book undergoes a dramatic shift from page to screen. It's a migration from print to cyberspace, and I'd like to explore the implications of this shift from page to screen. And as a starting point, I'd like to apply the French sociologist Jacques Ellul's comment about technology to the latest shift in book technology. Ellul says technology, or techne as he calls it, is the sacred organizing principle of our culture. And if technology is the sacred organizing principle, then digitization, the conversion of information into discrete units of data, is the God in the machine of our culture. The migration of information from page to screen forces the academic community in particular, and the civic community in general, to a crossroad, because we must respond to and adapt our practices to this new mode of expression. Many theorists who have studied this shift from page to screen ask the question, is this simply an evolution in the march of the progress of the book? Or is this a fundamental revolution that will radically alter human experience? So is it a revolution or an evolution? To answer the question, question is about this shift from page to screen. It is helpful to look at shifts in information technologies that have occurred in the past. How do the shifts reform the information, the cultures, and the techniques when old technologies and practices give way to new ones? If we look at the present shift from page to screen in terms of an evolutionary process, it's a kind of continuation of the changes that have occurred in the past, and the shift from page to screen doesn't look, doesn't seem quite so drastic. In today's mass media culture, books are ubiquitous, they're everywhere. Because they are so familiar, readers tend to forget that books are the result of several combined technologies: typography, printing, bookbinding, image making, and distribution. And these technologies have been refined over the centuries. The story of the book is the search for balance among the variables that make a book possible, such as a system of writing, tools for marking or imprinting, a reliable and durable medium that makes long-term storage possible. All of these. This set of variables is the lineage of the book, and the book emerges from this lineage. And its various incarnations are an experiment in balancing competing requirements. As author of A Splendor of Letters, that's the title of his book, Nicholas Basbanes has observed, writing technologies have always been about finding the right balance among competing goals: durability of the text, convenience of marking implements, ease of the use of the alphabet or script, portability, and historically the preservation of information has involved various compromises with the more durable materials, typically the most cumbersome to manufacture and to store, while the most efficiently produced are more vulnerable to deterioration. So what Basbanes means is that when it comes to writing technologies, there's always been the developments among the medium, the script, recording devices, and ease of use. To illustrate Basbanes' claim, I wanted to consider two ancient cultures and their methods of textual production. We'll look at the clay tablets produced in Mesopotamia and the papyrus scrolls produced in ancient Egypt. So let's take a look at clay tablets produced in Mesopotamia. In the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, as humans moved from agrarian to urban living, particularly in Mesopotamia, the need to record information brought about 3 innovations: a written script, the technologies of clay tablet use, and the emergence of social practices, including an elite class of scribes that controlled writing and established the tablet house that functioned as both a library and a classroom. Clay, the first writing material, reveals that humans found ways to preserve and store information vital to the success of an agrarian society. And following that, the tablets served the needs of the first cities, as administrative and religious activities required meticulous record-keeping, archival storage, and the exchange of diplomatic letters among neighboring city-states. Attendant practices rose around the use of clay tablets, such as the art of diplomacy, the training of a class of scribes, and the rise of an artisan class that created cylinder seals in the service of authentication. Clay tablets provided a means to represent physical space, and here's an example of an early map of Mesopotamia. You can see it's quite stylized. We have a simple circle, and Mesopotamia is in the center, and we have sort of an indication of the rivers on either side of it. So as you can see, it was a very simple representation of Mesopotamia. But the writing of the Mesopotamians, those who inhabited the region between the Tigris and Euphrates River in present-day Iraq, was prolific. Tens of thousands of clay tablets survive to this day, most awaiting to be cataloged and translated. And if these tablets represent only a fraction of the amount of tablets produced in ancient cities like Sumer, Uruk, Babylon, or Nineveh, then the total output of these cultures must have been prodigious. The types of documents that emerge from the use of clay tablets, they're astonishing in their variety. For example, the Sumerians created lists of all they observed, from types of birds to lists of professions. They also listed medicines and made calendars. Among the surviving artifacts are examples of religious, literary, and historical texts as well. Here we see a lexical list of musical instruments from ancient Sumer. So you can see how there was placement in columns, and of course you can see that it has been fragmented as well. But list making was one of the chief activities in those who made the clay tablets. And of course, cuneiform was the first script used in the Near East, and it was used for thousands of years, thousands, from around 3200 BC to 75 AD. It's remarkable that such a cumbersome kind of writing was used for so long. As you can see, it developed from earlier forms that were more pictographic in their style, and it developed through three phases: the simplest forms to an intermediate form, and then the very stylized form. It actually turned on its side at one point. So, developed from pictographs, the development traceable on clay tablets. A scribe using cuneiform learned around 600 signs with multivariant values, adding much more to that number. Only a small group of trained scribes could read and write such a complicated system. Royal palaces and temples then employed a cadre of scribes to keep track of economic transactions, record diplomatic letters, and train a new group of scribes. Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, was one of a handful of kings in antiquity who was actually literate. The techne of clay tablets is instructive for a modern understanding of the nature of the book. Ancient works in clay illustrate the means whereby the medium enables certain practices and constrains others. Cuneiform, developed for recording lists and inventories in clay, retained features of this origin throughout its use as a writing system. C.F. Walker, curator of Near Eastern Antiquities of the British Museum, notes that in some respects, the Sumerian script never quite escapes from the fact that it was originally designed for the purpose of practical bookkeeping rather than to express abstract ideas. So, papyrus eventually supplanted clay, and aren't you glad? Can you imagine taking the Epic of Gilgamesh to bed? Now I'm going to have a little bit of light reading tonight. You must have needed, a wheelbarrow to carry the clay tablets, or some kind of wheeled instrument to carry these things around. It must have been heavy and cumbersome. How could you do any kind of work with a clay tablet? So thankfully, papyrus gave us our precursor to paper. It eventually supplanted clay. Developed by the Egyptians, the papyrus scroll was far easier to transport and use than a clay tablet, and yet it was not as durable. Some say the modern book originated with the invention of the papyrus scroll. It is easy to see why this might be. For the first time in history, information was inscribed on paper rather than incised with a stylus onto a surface of stone or clay. The creation of paper and the use of a rolled manuscript allowed documents to be larger, more portable, and easier to store. And then, of course, the practical Egyptians created three types of script for recording information. And of course, we all know the Egyptian hieroglyphs, those famously preserved scripts that are in stone throughout Egypt. And those were reserved for Egypt's pharaohs. So writing brought to humans by Thoth, or Thoth, the god of wisdom, was the province of the priests and scribes, a class of scholars who were trained in the sacred practice of writing. But there were also cursive scripts, demonic and hieratic. They were developed for letter writing and record keeping. And sometimes the Egyptians wrote on linen as well as papyrus. So you can see the Egyptians were experimenting with a number of different kinds of scripts. They were experimenting with a number of different types of media, papyrus and linen, and stone, of course. To Egypt, generations of scholars owe the preservation of the ancient world. Many papyri were preserved for coming generations in tombs and settlements. In particular, at the edge of the desert and in dry sand over thousands of years, these documents were preserved. And some examples of famous Egyptian papyri include the Salier papyrus, dating from the 20th dynasty, or around 1180 BC. This papyrus, written in Egyptian hieratic script, contrasts two professions of Egypt, that of a scribe and that of a stonemason. Other examples, of which a large number survive, are funerary papyri, or mortuary spells, performed for pharaohs and other high officials. These are known collectively as the chapters of the coming forth by day, or more commonly, the Book of the Dead, which you already knew about because you saw the mummy, right? Anyway, that was a joke, you can laugh. One of the most well-known and best preserved of these books is that prepared for a high-ranking scribe called Ani, keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum at the turn of the 20th century. Wallace Budge writes, The Papyrus of Ani is the largest, the most perfect, and the best illuminated of all the papyri containing copies of the Theban recension of the Book of the Dead. The text is 78-foot scroll, and it demonstrates the sophisticated design of Egyptian book rolls. The next most important development was the widespread use of a practical script, an alphabet. And of course, we have the Greeks and the Romans to thank for our alphabet. This slide tries to help you understand how the various symbols were in a progression of a script, how the symbols actually became useful to our own time. You can see how the Phoenicians and the Egyptian hieroglyphic and hieratic script influenced our own present-day script that we received through the Greeks and the Romans. So this chart tries to help you see how that development occurred. We have the Greeks and the Romans to thank for our alphabet. We can learn 26 letters instead of thousands of logographic forms of Akkad or cumbersome Egyptian script. Some theorists, like Eric Havelock, argue that alphabetic literacy gave Greeks a distinct advantage over other ancient cultures because the Greek alphabet allowed them to read complex philosophical and theoretical texts. In many ways, then, the Greeks advanced the progress of the book through the refinement of a simple, efficient alphabet, phonetic alphabet, passed on to the Romans via the Etruscans and then to us. By the 5th century BC, some historians cite an earlier date, the science of making papyri had arrived in Greece. The oldest surviving Greek scroll is the Dreveni papyrus, so called for its discovery in a town near Thessalonica, Greece, dating to around 300 BC. Nicholas Basbanes, author of A Splendor of Letters, reports that the papyrus was discovered on a funeral pyre, its contents charred from a ritual intending to incinerate it. And as Roman rule spread throughout Europe, and as Christianity spread as well, the development of the modern book began in earnest. European monasteries began importing papyrus from Egypt. But when an Egyptian embargo restricted the amount of papyrus brought into Europe, scholars turned to a new medium for recording their texts. They turned to vellum, which is, this is leather. It could be calf skin, goat skin, in some cases even deer skin. The use of vellum rather than parchment engendered a new set of conditions for bookmaking. For one, vellum sheets could be stacked one on top of another more easily than they could be rolled into a scroll. Papyrus was rolled into a scroll. That's how it was stored and used. But vellum was stackable rather than rollable. Consequently, vellum sheets were no longer rolled up, but rather bound in what we recognize today as the modern codex book. For another, the codex was more resilient than the scroll, making study and reference easier. The codex book also entailed a new set of design features for text and image, and the new design brought about illuminated manuscripts. The imbrication of image and word are quite striking in the illuminated manuscripts that survive. Many of the illuminated manuscripts were commissioned by wealthy noblemen and women for their use in their private worship. The images promoted sacred devotion, especially to the Virgin Mary, resulting in a genre of illuminated manuscripts called the Book of Hours. Another example of an illuminated manuscript is the Sherborne Missal, and this shows the rich embellishment in the margins and the handwritten pages and the use of elaborate initials. And of course, when you consider that books were handwritten, you can imagine that the number of books that you could produce in a lifetime were very limited. Regarding the creation of elaborate illuminated manuscripts, historian of graphic design Philip Meggs writes, the Christian belief in sacred religious writings became the primary impetus for the preservation and making of books. Christian monasteries were the cultural, education, and intellectual centers of the medieval world. The monastic influence created the tradition of the scriptorium, and they were a whole group of scribes that would, and priests and monks that would get together and they would copy all, by hand, copy all the sacred texts. And these, of course, were the centers of great output of books, but of course it was limited because everything was handwritten. As universities were established, these also became the centers of manuscript production. So powerful were these scribal centers that they marshaled considerable resistance to the first printed books. At the forefront of this resistance was Johann Trithias, who was a scribe monk, and he said, the word written on parchment will last 1,000 years. The printed word is on paper. How long will that last? The most you can expect a book of paper to survive is 200 years. Yet, there are many who think they can entrust their works to paper. Only time will tell. You notice that there's a resistance to the printed word. So, although, of course, Gutenberg's printing press ended the age of handwritten text, there had been moments in the history of the book where printing had been practiced, though in a limited way. Some cultures experimented with different methods of recording and disseminating information, such as this palm leaf manuscript. As you can see, fragments of palms were inscribed with words and then sewn together. So it was an early attempt to try to pull together the information into one unit. We used to have a palm leaf manuscript book here in St. Augustine. It was in one of the antique shops around here, but it has since been sold, so I don't know what happened to it. And interestingly, the Chinese invented printing with wood blocks to produce multiple copies of Confucian and other religious documents. The oldest and most beautiful example of a Chinese woodcut text and image is the Diamond Sutra, pictured here. It's a scroll of a Buddhist religious text, and the scroll was preserved in a secret cave from 840 AD and then rediscovered in 1900. This image shows the frontispiece of an 18-foot scroll. Although the Chinese developed a kind of movable type, the large number of characters required to create documents made movable type impractical in the East. The Europeans, through Gutenberg, advanced the process of printing, which required the combined technologies of pressing, for wine pressing, engraving, and paper making. And of course, the effects of printing on the global culture is almost incalculable. For example, in 1450, the existence of all the books in all the world would fill a modest library. Handwritten books we're talking about now. But by 1500, about 50 years later, after the printing press began its output of printed books, there were millions of books in circulation. The effects of the number of books include the breakdown of monastic monopoly on textual production, and sometimes that could be violent. They would burn the printed books. Standardization of spelling and other printing conventions, such as paragraphing and other graphic design elements developed, typeface, for example. Writing the vernacular. You could read not just in Latin anymore, you could read in your own language, which was an amazing development for the production of books. There was, of course, the growth of literacy then, and of course, that with the printing of books, there was a huge explosion of knowledge as knowledge began to spread, as scientific treatises, distribution of information, such as simple things like tide tables, encyclopedias, maps, technical manuals, philosophical, scientific treatises. These were all distributed widely, and so there was a huge explosion of knowledge following the printing press. In short, the written text, the printed text, became the basis of all authoritative knowledge. With the development of printing, perhaps the most important social cultural shift was the rise of literacy. While the universities remained the centers of manuscript production, texts began to circulate beyond the constraints of monasteries and their Latin texts. As texts were written in the vernacular of the people, widespread literacy became the norm. Reading and writing were no longer the prerogative of a priestly scribal class or the nobility. Printing has been one of the most democratic of all the arts. Here we have the Codex Sinaiticus. It's a handwritten Bible. It's one of the oldest full text of the Bible. But notice that this became then the paradigm for all erudition. And after Gutenberg, the printed page became the medium for the distribution of knowledge. Many theorists who consider the shift from page to screen argue that the shift is simply the evolution of information storage and retrieval that has gone on for millennia. The screen then simplifies the distribution methods of text and allows readers to build their own virtual libraries, as Jerome did when he hand-copied ancient manuscripts. A really good example of the benefits of digitization is this William Blake's notebook. William Blake, of course, is a famous British poet, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. He was a poet, but he was also an artist, and this is his one-of-a-kind notebooks. This is held in the British Museum, but it has also been digitized, and if you run your cursor over the pages, they turn. It's as if you're turning the page. So notice how digitization is able to extend the life of this one-of-a-kind book, and they have many kinds of books like this. For example, they have Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the original handwritten book by Lewis Carroll there. They have ancient manuscripts. There's a book called, I can't remember the exact title, but it's about how herbal medicines can be, homeopathic, and you can, it's very beautiful to look at. And you can run your cursor over it, and you can turn the pages in this. Leonardo da Vinci's notebook is also in the British Museum, and you can you can scroll through his notebook. So notice how through digitization we can more broadly get access to these rare, one-of-a-kind texts. Nonprofit agencies can, with the help of digitization, increase public exposure to their data and documents. Libraries and historical societies can digitize their documents to save space and thus help scholars gain access to their materials. Some media theorists, like J. David Bolter in his book Writing Space, Computers, Hypertext, and the Remediation of Print, believe the computer screen allows us to bring back old practices, such as eliminating manuscripts, when page designs and image it. Certainly, advances in computer hardware and software allow users to create visual designs, a circumstance that has not been within the grasp of the average person until the last few years. Another theorist, Richard Lanham, believes the shift from page to screen will bring about a renaissance of the humanities. What might be called an eclipse of classical reading can, through digitization, bring about fresh interest in the classics. Another theorist who embraces the digital migration is Nicholas Negroponte, director of the MIT Media Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His book, Being Digital, proposes a new and forthcoming utopia, with electronic butlers, robot secretaries, and fleets of digital assistants. Boy, I could use one of those. In Negroponte's world, computers see and hear, respond to your every murmur, show tact and discretion, and gauge their interactions according to your individual predilections, habits, and social behaviors. Negroponte's lively future scenarios in which digital servants uncomplainingly do our bidding are always positive, unproblematic, and without social costs. Not everyone embraces the shift from page to screen, digital migration, with such enthusiasm, however. Media theorist Sven Berkers argues that the shift from page to screen is indeed a revolution, the kind humanity will never recover from. Berkers believes the shift from page to screen is a revolution because the ink and paper of the printed page have material existence, while the bits and bytes of the screen do not have material existence. And the shift from page to screen is then a shift from the real, the physically real artifact, to the immaterial, to the virtual. And the shift from real to virtual is a revolution that threatens not just academia, but our communities as well. So let me illustrate the difference between the real and the virtual, the real material object versus its virtual doppelganger. Recently, I accessed the online holdings of the rare books and special collections of the Hesburgh Library at the University of Notre Dame. One of the virtual displays showed a royal building inscription cylinder that commemorated the building of a temple dedicated by Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar about 605 BC. The digital image of the cylinder made the cylinder appear large, perhaps several feet tall. It also seemed to be made of solid clay. The cuneiform script that covered the cylinder surface is difficult to make out, even in the enlargement option available online. In addition to a photo of the cylinder, the exhibit included a bit of background on the discovery of the clay cylinder. So that was my experience with this online encounter with this cylinder. Then, several weeks after I viewed the object online, I went physically to visit Notre Dame's special collections in person. And one of the objects I viewed there was the clay cylinder I had seen on the webpage. When the special collections archivist presented me with the clay cylinder, this very thing, I was quite surprised. Very surprised, in fact. When I saw it handled the real version of Nebuchadnezzar's cylinder, I realized I'd been too quick to judge the cylinder's virtual representation. In fact, it looks like it's stretched. It looks like the image of the cylinder has been stretched in the online version because the cylinder is only about 8 inches tall, but it looks very much longer and taller in the photo. For another, the cylinder was to be read on its side, not standing on its end as the online photo suggested. Moreover, the cylinder was not solid, but was hollow, much like a flower pot, with openings at both ends. Some crystallization on one section of the cylinder surface gave me the sense of the cylinder's passage through time. These were the experience I had, one virtual, the other real, with an object from the ancient world. To investigate further how shifts from real to virtual experiences might influence our knowledge making, I asked some of my students to compare their experiences of visiting a real museum versus their taking a tour of the museum's virtual counterpart. When students wrote about their experiences of real and virtual museums, their narratives not surprisingly focused on the differences in the physical properties of the two worlds. The real museums gave students a sense of the size and complexity of objects. For example, some students visited Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry. Anybody visit that? Okay, a couple of you. They went to the walk-through heart, a whisper chamber, which is two parabolic dishes that focus sound. You can, as far away as from here to the other side of the room, you can hear a whisper on the other side of the room through this the whisper chamber. Body worlds, the chick hatchery, a captured German U-boat, and a coal mine. Many students discussed their visit to the captured German submarine, the U-505. They described the archival footage they saw from World War II depicting Germany's use of U-boats in the war and the capture by the Allied forces of one of the boats. Part of the U-boat exhibit included a view of German torpedoes, and they said it's a lot larger than those depicted in Hollywood movies. Inside the submarine, the cramped living space encouraged students to imagine men living under such conditions where every movement required ducking or squeezing through a tight passage. When students wrote about the real museum experience, their narratives often emphasized how real objects inspired them to make a personal connection to a larger world. For example, students who visited the Body Worlds exhibit in Museum of Science and Industry, Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, they found an intriguing display of human tissue in cross-section. Real bone, skin, tissue, organs. They were real slices from a real body, not from plastic or other artificial material, but from a human cadaver. Students made a connection to the exhibit by recognizing that all people look very different on the outside, but look the same on the inside. Students also noted that the observable details of a real exhibit reinforced historical narratives about objects and events. For example, students who visited the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum described the first gallery that you go into when you first walk in. It displays examples of several planes in the development of flight. They reported their experience of viewing Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis suspended overhead with its wings spanning the gallery. Students noted that the plane was made of cloth and thus seemed too flimsy to have made that historic flight to Paris. In another section of the Air and Space Museum, students viewed an actual Mercury space capsule. They saw the display and noted the capsule seemed way too small for a man to fit inside. Another detail was the scorching on the capsule's heat shield that was pitted and charred. It was sort of a revelation that this went through a fiery re-entry. The visible details corroborated the reasons why humans celebrate achievements in flight, because those first steps were courageous feats accomplished in flimsy, dangerous experimental craft. Then when students analyzed online museums, their analyses focused on how effectively the museum had translated the museum into the virtual world. A museum successfully translated the museum experience if the creators had fully utilized the capabilities of the computer. One capability students evaluated was the rendering of visual information in online exhibits. Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, for example, offered a cutaway view of the U-505, showing the structure of the inner hull, as well as a detailed overview of the arrangement of the submarine's compartments. When students wrote about museum online exhibits, the dynamic display of the virtual museum's exhibits appealed to them. For example, the U-505 display allowed viewers to click on the submarine's compartments in order to activate expanded views for additional facts. And the site also included a history of submarines, particularly their use in World War II, and the story of the capture of U-505. And part of the dynamic display included interactive features that contributed to students' visits. Students could go to an interactive page where they experimented with buoyancy to understand how the U-boat adjusted its depth. In other words, the dynamic display of the online museum encouraged students to explore on their own. When students examined the online museum, they noted that the interactive features of the museum's online site usually included helpful links to other databases. And by following the links, the students said they could find out more information about an exhibit than a visit to the real museum might afford. The amount of information available through links, students reported, empowered them to personalize their own museum tour. Thus, students felt awe not at the size of a real object on display, but at the amount of information available in the virtual world. Students who favored the experience of the real museum over its online counterpart focused on the vividness of the museum experience. They noted that observable details, such as a pitted heat shield, corroborated the facts of an object's passage through time, or the physical forces that affected an object, such as heat, gravity, or light. Perhaps because the sensations of the real are so vivid, the physical presence of the real, unique object still confers a sense of value to an object. In a world of simulacra, the real confers a distinction upon an object that the virtual objects lack. The presence of the real object was so intense that by contact with it, one's misconceptions or preconceptions might be overturned. A point students noted more than any other was the expenditure of resources required to visit the real museum. Those who favored the real museum described the expensive and sometimes arduous trip to visit the museum. It required them to allocate a limited amount of time to certain exhibits. They wrote about, well, trying to decide which exhibits they should visit, which ones could they bypass. And of course, you have a limited amount of time, so you can pick and choose. You must pick and choose. Student narratives about the sacrifices of time, attention, and resources reveal the value humans place on unique objects, because those artifacts establish a sense of place in history. Some students argue that the sacrifice of time and energy is part of the context of knowledge making. Important things require sacrifices, so excursions to museums are worthy of time and energy. In exchange for expending energy, a museum promises to create an experience of traveling inside a spacecraft, working inside a coal mine, or harvesting wheat in a combine. Then, those students who favored the online museum noted the efficiency of the virtual world. Its efficiency was the most common advantage students saw with the real. For example, visitors spent as much or as little time at one exhibit as they wished, because the museum online is always open. The efficiency of the online museum means visitors may gather more facts and visit more exhibits than they might in the real museum. Furthermore, visitors made fewer sacrifices for the information they acquired online. Students noted another aspect of the online museum's efficiency, its ability to display multiple forms of an exhibit. Students who favored the online world saw that the virtual museum could display multiple exhibits of a certain artifact, where the real museum might show only one display at a time. In fact, since floor space in a museum is limited, not all the museum's holdings may be on display. So, the online museum was able to display these additional holdings, and thus the virtual museum may serve as an archive for the physical museum, allowing the museum to extend its physical collection. Many students who favored an online visit saw the multiple displays as a measure of the value of information available online. Since more information is better, they argued, the learning they acquired in the online museum was more significant. However, the presence of a unique, singular, observable object in a real museum is the reason we privilege the real over the virtual. The differences between the real and the virtual are important then with respect to the privileging of observation, because the museum experience in online spaces attempts to replicate this experience, but without the physical presence of the unique object. Thus, observing and making inferences, the basic activities of all learning in the real world, do not always translate to the virtual. In a similar vein, students noted that visitors to a real museum typically observe static, stationary objects. Many students preferred the virtual object because they could rotate it, examine it in cutaway view, expand it through interactive options. The static object, while it might evoke a sense of awe and appreciation of the past, did not always promote a sense of discovery. So, learning needs to be active, students argue, because active engagement stimulates the imagination and prompts more questions. Students rated more highly those learning situations where they could imagine connections and make their own inquiries. So as you can see, students go back and forth on this. Many of course see the advantages of an online museum, prefer that because it's so efficient. So some students realized that the ability to achieve more information was not necessarily the same thing as building knowledge. Learning, they argued, involves not just contact with data, but some kind of interaction with data. Learning involves making associations and often learning in connection with other people who ask questions and engage in conversations. We can draw inferences, connect facts to previous learning, and examine assumptions. Thus, the sense that one learns more in the virtual world because more information is available may be an illusion, because knowing facts is not the same thing as developing knowledge and wisdom. So, coming back to our original question then, is the migration to the digital world an evolution or a revolution? To answer the question, we must consider how the ability to render material objects as digital facsimiles has far-reaching implications, not only for the material objects like books, and also for places like museums and libraries where objects must compete for space, but also for humans, and we'll get to that in a moment. Michael Gallen, now retired from his position as director of Proctor Library, speaks of a book depository in Florida where books are organized not by their content, nor by their subject or catalog number, but by the space they take up. An example like the Florida Book Depository suggests that old books and other rare material objects traditionally stored in museums and historical societies may very well be at risk in the digital future, particularly as a new generation raised on digital devices will become those who decide how to allocate space and money for the continuation of these historical and cultural depositories. Another implication of screen life has to do with our social consciousness. Researcher of virtual identity formation, Sherry Turkle, in her study of humans and computers, analyzes the desire of humans to shape their online avatars. She says, we seem to accomplish more, to be more in the virtual world. We may project an image of ourselves that has nothing to do with the physical reality of our bodies, like a cave wall. The tabula rasa of the online labyrinth allows us to take whatever shape we desire, animated by imagination and the flickering screen of a computer console. We can create a modern doppelganger by entering a virtual space with its promise to cure the malaise of modern life. Turkle also writes in her book, Alone Together, how young people depend on instant messaging. And by the way, it's not just young people. My sister and her husband were in town, and they were on their devices all the time. They were in town last week, and they were constantly checking out. They watched a game. My brother-in-law watched a game on his device. So it's not just young people. I don't want to just single them out. But notice that my brother-in-law and sister-in-law grew up without these devices, and they have very good social skills. But Turkle worries about the developing social consciousness of young people. She says that they're conducting friendships via these devices, and indeed we now know from neuroscience research that certain areas of the brain determine the development of social judgment, and that these areas rely on input from all five senses in order to help us make decisions about what would be an appropriate response to a situation. When children and teenagers communicate via the typed word as they learn about human interactions and friendships, they don't develop the skills of friendship or the sound social judgment that they would if they had face-to-face contact the way that we used to do. So digitization poses an unclear future, not only for books or rare objects, but for humanity itself. The digital human is not just the premise for science fiction, but is a reality right now. The IBM company has created Watson. Has anybody seen that? Have you seen that? Okay. It was designed to be the best contestants of Jeopardy, and he won, by the way. And Watson calls into question the very definition of what it means to be human. Are humans simply socially programmed machines? Negroponte, who I referred to before, he's the author of Being Digital, asserts that being digital is inevitable, like a force of nature. What Mother Nature fails to provide will be taken care of by the engineers in the Media Lab at MIT. His uncritical acceptance of the digital human should be a warning to us all. So this paper not only reminds us about what is at risk in the shift from page to screen, from the real to the virtual, but also will, I hope, stir us to action. We can be conscientious in the technologies we support, favoring those technologies that promote real and virtual experiences as mutually interactive, mutually sustaining experiences. We can conscientiously support the continuation of spaces that offer contact with the real, undiminished object preserved for us in libraries, museums, and historical societies. Thank you. Take questions now, right? Okay. All right, yeah, Julie.
Simple. Yeah.
Yes.
Papyrus. It looked like it was made of bamboo. Was bamboo? Is that correct? Papyrus.
Okay, Julie's asking the question, what, it looked like the papyrus was made out of bamboo. And actually papyrus was a reed that grew along the Nile River, and there was, it grew in the abundance there. And what they did was, what the Egyptians did was they would cut down the stalk of the papyrus, and they would split it, and then they would actually make it into a kind of paste that would dry. You can see the fibers in actual papyri if you would lay it out. You can see the papyrus fibers. So it was a reed that grew along the Nile River, and of course it grew in abundance. So the Egyptians were able to use this and were able to to take what nature had given them and use it. And of course the papyrus scrolls were lasted or they used the papyrus, the practice of inscribing papyrus scrolls, it lasted for centuries. Yeah, that's a good question. Papyrus, not bamboo. It looked like bamboo, didn't it? Other questions? Did you have a question?
You know, last week we ended a conference through Lewis Auditorium with fake news. And the struggle that we're having, what's opinion, what's fact, and when you've got somebody who's being, the brain is, you've got hard drives. Yes. And so it changes the whole world about virtual reality and fact and opinion. To me, if you can create your own fact or your own world, what does that do to what really happened or what really happened? So I know it's changing journalism. I'm just learning.
We are in an interesting time.
You create your own fact.
The statement has been, this couple here attended a lecture at Lewis Auditorium, and the subject there was the problem that the digitization of information has created. It used to be where universities were the sort of the gatekeeper of information, and you could trust information that came out of this university because they were vetted through all kinds of we have to go through peer review, for example, to get our stuff published. So you can't just put information out there; it has to go through a very strict screening process. So what happens if anybody can hang a shingle out there on the internet, and our sense of information is changing? So I think that you're asking a question about authority. Where is our authority coming from in these online texts? And of course, that's one of the things that I have to teach in writing classes. Wikipedia is maybe not the best place to go for information. You should look for a source that comes from a university, people that have studied this stuff. But yes, you're right about this, that we're are certainly the question of authority is under attack. I was going to say something else, but now I can't think of what I was going to say. Did you have a question? Okay.
As we were going through this, a couple of things occurred to me. One is that if you added the third dimension concept to the screen, it would change some of the observations that you were talking about between the reality and the two-dimensional speech. That's one comment. The other one is that it would be interesting to broaden the concept of the screen to behavior patterns. Because, thinking about behavior patterns of the papyrus world and the Gutenberg world and the book world and the screen, digital world, in terms of behavior of social interactions would be interesting.
Yeah. Yes. All right.
So the gentleman here brought up the fact that I only really looked at a very limited range in the way that we interact with the screen information. But as you have rightly pointed out, we can also advance this idea of the screen interaction and what kind of practices does the screen promote. And I think what we're going to be seeing in the future with the screen and the behaviors that the screen is prompting is that right now the screen is imitating the page. We notice that we go to a web page, we go to a screen page, but what are some of the functions of the screen? In other words, it allows three-dimensionality, and that will definitely create certain kinds of intellectual changes. I feel that in the future we're going to become, and well, you guys probably, you watch Star Trek, the holodeck, right? Well, a really interesting book is called Hamlet on the Holodeck. What happens when all of our educational information is inside these spheres where we have these, we can recreate, Pickett's Charge, for example, where we're actually there at the Peloponnesian Wars, where we see the signing of the Declaration. All of that is sort of created for us in this virtual cave or virtual room. What will happen when education becomes like that? How will that change our intellectual engagement with information? How will that affect our, the development of our minds? Well, it's going to have some pretty severe impact, and so you rightly bring up the idea of our behavior will change, as these technologies develop. I think, yeah. Hamlet on the Holodeck, cool, yeah.
Okay, I see, when you're lecturing, it's very good. I see language as a tool. At the beginning with the play, it seemed like it was a tool to remember. And I worry about as we continue with all of the technology, will it be a tool for manipulation? Right now, we have so much information, we can create our own reality. And we see that in the world right now. And the person who has the language and power to understand manipulate other people, will we be able to control this tool? It's,
Who's going to control it? Right.
yes, and they use it for power. How do we do that?
Yes.
Yeah, the comment that has been raised is, I have a microphone, that's why I'm going back and forth like this. This audience member has raised the question of how language is a tool for manipulation. Who controls the kind of information that's going to be possible in these online spaces? And that is a huge question. I'm sure you probably are familiar with 1984, the book 1984, right? Big Brother. In that book, Winston was a man who worked for the Ministry of Truth. And of course, the Ministry of Truth was far from it. What they did was they took information and made it into, they rewrote it, so it became a lie. So in the book 1984, the Ministry of Truth was the faction that was manipulating information. What I fear is that information and commercialization are going to be mixed. In other words, information is combined with entertainment, and to me that is a frightening merging. My students, of course, feel this, or need to be a little bit more critical, I think, of the way in which all information is now tied to what they buy, and the merging of information. And I think that you raise a really good point. Who really is in control of how the information is placed out there? Who will be manipulating our young people's minds? Excellent point. Yeah. Other questions, Julie?
Yeah, people will take any kind of measure. Paper takes any kind of measure.
Yeah.
And the internet is taking any kind of measure.
Yeah, Julie has pointed out that there's no screening process for the internet. You can put anything out there, and it's not necessarily true, not necessarily accurate, because there's no vetting process. Although there's situations where someone has manipulated the print culture as well, so that's not completely foolproof. But, yes, sir?
I was wondering about comparing the virtual visit to a museum versus actually going. What if they did a virtual visit first and went
did the virtual and real experience, how was it chronologically created? Did they visit the real first and then the virtual, or did they visit the virtual and then the real? I think, I can't remember, I can't answer that everyone visited the real first and then wrote about it when they visited the virtual. A lot of these students, went to these places when they were younger, before the internet, made these virtual museums possible. So I would imagine that the majority of them went to the real first and then to the virtual second. But your question implies which shapes which experience more. Is it possible for the real to influence the virtual, or the virtual to experience, to influence the real? And I would like to do another test on this and have them go to the virtual first and then the real, and see how the real maybe overturns misconceptions, which might be a really interesting job. Sir?
I think it might be interesting to consider whether any kind of historical object is in some sense virtual. Because if you put it in a museum, it's no longer in the context of its original function. And so aren't we just going a little further towards virtualization, which we're already encased in, really, as far as knowing the past?
Good point, yes. Yes, excellent point.
Yeah, the gentleman in the audience said, when you take an object out of its historical context, isn't it virtual? So yeah, isn't that a good? It's a very smart way to think about it. We're just really extending what is already being done by ripping an object out of its context. We're just really turning it into. Yeah, Tanya.
Pretending to be an audience member right now. So pretend I'm sitting. But for those of you who are interested in the question on authority, specifically related to digital information, usually I'd say write your congressman, but now maybe you can call your congressman. Actually, this week, that's something that they're voting on in Congress, is the control of, specifically some of the examples they're using is tracking what you purchase online and using that in various ways, which they haven't actually identified of how that would be used. So if you are concerned about the use of your personal digital information and the authority of that, just letting you know that that is something that's being talked about right now.
Well, thank you so much for your time.